tutorial is that it's now working. Yeah. The context for tonight's tutorial, of course, is that we have the global conference of the parties organised by the United Nations in Glasgow, COP26, where there will be huge decisions to be made about meeting targets for removing carbon from production and distribution processes in our economies around the world. And associated with that, of course, we have the lunatic scramble of the Morrison government to work out what it is going to say to the Australian people about what it is going to say in Glasgow. And I don't wish to go into any detail about that, but because I'm sure that Luke and Colin will be making some comments about it. But in the middle of all this, there has been precious little discussion about the extra unfair impact of out of control climate change on the situation for low income working class people. Most of the discussion has sought to protect those who own and control the fossil fuel industry and their profits priority, and along the way are expressing a hypocritical and false concern for the workers in those industries. So with that, let's turn now to our guest tutors and get them talking. We say thank you very much and welcome in particular to Luke Skinner from the Climate Justice Union, which is based in Perth, Western Australia. The Climate Justice Union, we're going to learn a lot more about at the moment, because one of our objectives tonight is for Luke and Colin to be able to talk a little bit about why their organisations are so important for the broader union and social welfare and environmental movements. Our second speaker, or second tutor, in no particular order of course, is Colin Long. And Colin is the Environment and Climate Justice Campaigner at the Victorian Trades Hall Council, and he is speaking with the authority of the Secretary of the Council, Luke Hilakari, so I'm sure he will explain. And at some stage, we will post details about the information that's available at their websites. So to get things started, and finally, I just have to add one more thing. Some of us are associated with a global organisation called Trade Unions for Energy Democracy. And the Trade Unions for Energy Democracy has organised a whole program of events that will be happening over the next week or so in Glasgow and close to Glasgow. And we will put information up about the program of events that the Trade Unions for Energy Democracy, TUED, is presenting, so that you can join in, provided, of course, we can get the time differences aligned. So, with that in mind, we now turn to Luke and Colin, and perhaps Luke, if you could lead off in the first set of questions. Both of you, we're asking you to tell us about yourselves and the organisations that you are involved with, that we're talking with. What are your immediate and longer-term, medium-term objectives in particular? So, Luke, would you like to lead off, and then we'll go to Colin?
Sure. So obviously, as you mentioned, I'm from Climate Justice Union, based here in Western Australia. Before I get going, I want to pay my respects to the Whadjuk Noongar people and acknowledge their elders past and present, and like you, acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded on these lands. Climate Justice Union is an organisation that's been around, officially around as an organisation anyway, for a little over 2 years, 2 years and 1 month. We have members that kind of range throughout society. You don't need to be a working person to join Climate Justice Union. We're not in that way, in that traditional sense, a union that represents people in the workplace. We're more a union in the sense of the American Civil Liberties Union or the Union of Concerned Scientists, where we're a group of people with, a collective concern, that we are using collective organising, the same principles as union organising, to address those concerns, and pool our energy and our resources and our money and those kinds of things towards getting a transition, particularly here in Western Australia in the first instance, So we kind of came about as an organisation. We were launched in September of 2019, but we kind of, our birth story, our foundation story probably comes in around late 2018, when myself and a couple of other people from the grassroots organising of climate actions here in WA, Jamie Yallop Farrant and Sally Forrest, and a few other people who dipped in and out, kind of got together late in 2018, and we went, well, we've been doing a really good job. We've been getting more divestments in WA, more councils divested, more unis divested, more organisations divested than other states per head of population kind of thing. Our volunteer organising has resulted in some really good big actions. We've been, mentoring people. We've been having people, get arrested, taking direct action at the offices of fossil fuel companies and all of those kinds of things, but ultimately what was happening was that Western Australia's emissions were rising quite rapidly still at that point in time. And in fact, it was rising to such an extent that every other state in the country, with the occasional exception of Queensland, because they had a blip because of LNG export increases, but every other state was decreasing their emissions. And Western Australia's rise in emissions was enough to make it so that the whole of Australia's emissions were rising. So it was very clear to us that we were losing, despite being, doing a lot of good work. Long story short, we spent several months getting together every week for a few hours, or actually more like 6 hours with a lunch in between, around some whiteboards and doing some strategic planning and looking at what does it look like for Western Australia to do its fair share on climate change and on reducing emissions, but also on preparing people in Western Australia for the impacts of climate change. Because much like many of the other states in Australia, we really are heavily impacted by the impacts of climate change, fires, floods, droughts, all of those bits and pieces. And we realized it was a really big operation, essentially, that we needed to shift the whole of our society and economy's setup to one that focuses on preserving, preserving and improving life for humans and animals and plants and the ecosystems as the center of how it operates. This is just a little small ask of a not yet existent organization. So we don't really think it's up to us to change the whole of society, but we want to make sure as Climate Justice Union that we have an eyesight on that the people who should be responsible for these kinds of changes, whether they're bosses in a workplace, whether they're, people who are at a department level or a regulatory authority, whether they're ministers, whether they're local, state, federal government, whoever the decision makers might be, and also the people who have to make change, collectively in their own workplaces and lives too, whoever needs to be involved in making those decisions, we essentially want to make sure that the people who are impacted by decisions around climate change are involved in making those decisions, and we want to look at focusing our work where we're going to have, the most impact on a transition. So in WA, that's kind of meant for us looking not just at where is there opportunity to abate emissions, reducing emissions. Obviously, there's coal mining and coal-fired power plants, and we've done some work supporting the transition around Collie here in Western Australia with the unions in the southwest who are involved in that space. But we've also had a really big focus on working with the health sector and looking at how are humans looked after when we already have a healthcare system that is stretched even before COVID came along, and the impacts of extreme weather are only making that worse, and climate change will make that worse over the long time. And also looking in the mental health space. So they're probably our major priorities in the short term.
Thank you very much, Luke. That's a terrific introduction. And as I hand over to Cole, just a quick remark to all of those who are watching this. If there's any questions that come to mind as you listen to our guest tutors, then please paste them in the Facebook message, and Chip Elling will pick that up and pass it on to us. Or if you're actually in the Zoom registration attendees, then you can put a question into the Q&A or the chat, and we'll pick that up and enable some people at least to be able to ask the questions in person as we go. So, Cole, thank you very much. It's your turn to tell us all about the work that's happening at the Victorian Trades Hall Council.
Thanks, Don. Hi, everyone. I don't think just having a quick look at the participants, I don't think I need to explain to people what Trades Hall Council is, which is good. Many of those participants have been around the hall a lot longer than I have. So it's great to have you participating and to be talking to. So as Don said, I'm the Just Transitions organiser at Trades Hall. I'm responsible for climate and just transitions. I'm also responsible for developing the cooperative economy, and I actually spend a lot of my time working on cooperatives, particularly supporting the earthwork and network, and which includes the solar hot water factory in Morwell. We're setting up a new smart energy cooperative at the moment. We have an asylum seeker cooperative, a cleaning cooperative, and we also are co-owners with quite a number of unions now, and Friends of the Earth and some environment organisations, some community climate organisations with Cooperative Power, which is a cooperative electricity retailer. So we're trying to build that, we're trying to democratise the economy and bring that social interest into the climate transition. And I suppose what fundamentally what we're trying to do at Trades Hall, I suppose, is recognise that the energy transformation and the climate transition will necessitate the biggest restructuring of the Australian economy in history. And if workers aren't at the centre of that restructuring, workers and unions are only too familiar with what happens when they're not put at the centre of restructuring. They get screwed, whether it's restructuring of textile, clothing and footwear, or the car industry, or any other industry restructuring. When employers just gets given some money to add to redundancy packages or pay people to do a little bit of tweaking of their CVs, the outcomes for workers are not good. So we demand that the union movement really step up and become leaders in dealing with climate change and not leaving it up to the government. Well, at the moment, the federal government's doing nothing, so there's nothing to leave them. We can't leave it up to them. But it's also not, we're not interested in hero tech capitalists leading the way either. At the moment, we'll build alliances with anyone who wants to take the right action to deal with climate change, but we don't trust capitalists of any sort to put workers at the forefront of the transition. So that's the role of unions, to put workers at the forefront, and that's what we're trying to do. At the moment, we're doing a fair bit of work on education and training for delegates and activists. We started that with ACTU a little while ago, just finished last night a 4-week, 4-day, 4-evening training program with the Victorian delegates and activists. We've got another one coming up on the 6th of November. And then we hope to continue to roll that out with the ACTU at a national level. But also my goal is that we will offer it if unions want us to come out and do it in their places, or if people want us to go to workplaces and deliver some of the training. That would be my ideal, actually. Why should workers have to come into Trades Hall or wherever to learn about what's happening with climate change? So I suppose that's our key. We do a lot of policy work as well. We're trying to encourage unions to set up their own climate and environmental policy committees and organising committees, and a number of unions are doing some great work there. And we're participating in lots of ways in Victorian government processes around renewable energy, development of the clean energy workforce for the future, and things like that. And
Perhaps.
we also do, I do a fair bit of work for Trades Hall at an international level as well.
Yes, and of course you are one of the regular Australians in Trade Unions for Energy Democracy at the global level. Perhaps we'll keep you talking at this stage, Colin, and then swing to Luke on the same question. But really, it's about, if you could elaborate on what you were saying about the, if you like, the connection between climate change and jobs and incomes, and maybe tell everyone a little bit about the report that you produced a few months ago, which is arguably the most comprehensive of the just transition type reports that have come up in Australia so far. So let's switch the discussion to dig in a little bit deeper about the links between climate change and jobs and incomes. Over to you, Colin, and then Luke, you have a go at it as well after that.
So that report we put out last year was actually, we tried to take the two crises, the COVID crisis and also the climate change crisis, because the COVID crisis is very much, okay, it's a zoonotic disease virus that's come in, but it's really been so that's one crisis. But when that is dealt with, when that subsides, the climate crisis will still very much be afoot, and we're going to have to deal with that even more seriously. But both those crises, and we were very clear about this in relation to COVID. COVID, in many ways, has been a big stress test on our societies, and our societies in many ways have been found wanting. And on things like insecure employment, we know that workers who are insecurely employed, who rely on casual work, they're never sure whether they're going to be called by the boss this week or not, or next week. A lot of those workers have felt they've had to go to work when they should be isolating or when they're feeling sick. And that's been part of the spread of COVID in a number of workplaces, is through that mechanism where workers they don't have sick leave because they just don't have sick leave, they're casuals. They're worried about where their next dollar is going to come from. And remember, JobKeeper excluded a whole lot of casuals from payments. It excluded anyone on temporary visas of whatever nature, and that was like just a deliberate intention was to immiserate a substantial number of people in the country, and it did, and only the good work of a number of voluntary organisations and people that kept those people literally out of the gutter. So all of those things, it just showed that, and we've seen as well that the virus is, it affects people differentially according to class, and how class is manifested geographically within cities and states. The places that have been most badly affected usually are lower income parts of the city, places where you have large families, potentially large migrant families where they're not very well tied in with mainstream services, where English might be a second language issue, and we haven't been very good at communicating with those communities over a long period of time. In fact, in some ways, the state government in Victoria has improved during the pandemic because it's had to, but a lot of work still to be done. So access to healthcare, which has always been class defined and always been subject to your income, again, that has been proven to be a major problem during the pandemic. So bringing, and all of those problems are the same when it comes to climate change in so many ways. The insecurity of employment, it's really hard for unions to organise insecurely employed workers. That's why there is so much casual employment in this country. It makes it hard to unionise people. And workers who are just scraping through from day to day in an insecure job, trying to make a living, don't have the headspace in their workplace to be thinking about what's the transition? What's a better job for me? What is my employer doing to reduce their environmental impact and all of those sorts of things? So we made the case in that report that we have to deal with all of these big structural problems if we're going to deal with the pandemic on one side, and if we're going to deal with climate change. And we made, I'll finish here and let Luke go on, but we made the point that there's going to be massive government assistance to deal with the pandemic, and there has been, and that should be geared to having geared to a renewable energy future and recreating manufacturing jobs, and it should be a sustainable stimulus, or whatever you want to call it. Unfortunately, from a federal government level in Australia, we're the worst, I think the worst in the OECD in terms of the percentage of stimulus money that has gone to sustainable projects as a result of COVID spending, which is yet another indictment on the federal government if we need any more. So maybe I'll just leave it there for now.
You just sort of throw into that before Luke picks it up that all of that government money being thrown into the hands of the employers during the period of COVID, of course, profits have not just been maintained, but the massive profits, the volume of profits have been going up. But what is now demonstrable is that there is now a several-year trend where the proportion of those profits that are being productively invested, especially into renewables and the capacity to manufacture and distribute goods on a renewable basis, is less. It's going down. So there's a question that also arises from all that, but I'm going to let Luke jump in now and talk a bit about that whole question about the links between climate change, jobs and incomes. Thanks, Luke.
Yeah, so I mean, there's a whole lot of extra bits that you've just talked about that I'd love to respond to there as well, but I'll try to get back to the original question.
Yeah.
Although I do also just want to send a shout out to, there's a petition being run by some home care workers based in the Hunter in New South Wales against the federal government's Kurri Kurri gas plant, which would see, I think it's $660 million spent on a gas plant in the Hunter that's not really needed or wanted in any way, shape or form. And they're calling for that money to be redistributed half and half between supporting the transition funding for fossil fuel workers in the Hunter, and then recognising and paying better the care workers who are based in the Hunter as well. And we know that, the care economy is a low carbon economy, and we also know that in places like the Hunter and other places where there is heavy industry is a predominant part of the economy, those communities also need a higher amount of care for people who are older because of the physical stresses of the jobs that they put themselves through. So it's a really pertinent position, and so it's being run by United Workers Union members, and if you look up, Hunter petition, United Workers Union, you'll find it quite easily. But back to the question of the connection between, jobs, between incomes and climate. I mean, I think that the connection with jobs, there's 100 different ways you can connect it with jobs. Some jobs have to go, some jobs have to change, some new jobs need to be created. That's part of any transition. I also think that we're in an interesting time where the transition is also one that may eliminate a lot of jobs that have nothing to do with the transition, nothing to do with fossil fuels, but in the process of big transitions and big reshaping of society, like Colin's been saying, companies are not going to put workers at the front, they're going to put their profits at the front unless workers are, they're demanding to be dealt with. And so what that will mean is, we're switching out this part of the processing facility. If we're talking about a processing facility, we're going to turn it into an automated one instead and get rid of that job altogether, things like that. And, the transport sector, for example, is an industry that's about to go through shifting from one fuel source, one energy source that is highly polluting, into a hopefully clean energy source. And in that process, probably have to change almost all of its infrastructure. And there is a massive risk of huge amounts of redundancies in the transport sector through to automation in that process. And I think, that's both linked and not linked to climate change. That's linked to technology, but it's also linked to climate change because we probably just can't afford to have the same amount of personal cars on the road globally, what there are now, still in 10 years' time. And that will probably mean having some of those jobs lost to automation, and so whenever we're talking about income, jobs, and climate change, we're talking about sacrifice. We're talking, about real people. We're talking about potential for harm, but we're also talking about reducing vulnerability in our society. If we're having the conversation properly, the reason that income matters when we're talking about climate change is about reducing the vulnerability to climate change across our whole society. The people in our society who are most at risk are the people who are most vulnerable. And there's a bunch of different ways that you can be vulnerable. Class and income is, very, very high on the types of vulnerability that will be impacted by climate change. The lower socioeconomic bracket you're in, the more likely you are to be living in a place in Penrith that gets up to 50 degrees Celsius and doesn't have adequate, cooling and doesn't have adequate insulation, and, to become, the more likely you are to become one of those statistics of people who die during heat waves, and, let's not pretend this is a future issue. We have been having people die from heat waves in Australia for a long time, but increasingly so over the last 30 years as a result of climate change. When the big, was it the Black Saturday? I can't remember, the bushfires that were 10 years ago thereabouts in Victoria and killed a large number of people, 100 and something people. You probably know better than me, being in WA. I don't want to do any disrespect by getting the number wrong. But what I do know is that in the week before that, nearly 400 people, more than double the amount of people, died from the heat exposure. And that's a fact that Dr. Leslie Hughes likes to bring up when she's talking about the impacts of climate change in Australia. And that was 10 years ago, and it doesn't stop, it continues. So really for me, I think we need to have a strong and solid investigation of how we have a guaranteed wage situation that is at the poverty level, slightly above the poverty level, so that we can eliminate poverty in Australia and across the world as one of the ways of actually rapidly permanently reducing our vulnerability to climate change. And, we know that we can do it. You were talking about the pandemic and about JobKeeper earlier. Well, last year, for a brief period of time, when JobKeeper and JobSeeker were lifted, we pretty much eliminated poverty in Australia, and then the federal government made a conscious decision to reintroduce poverty into Australia when they unwound those things. And you know what? We also proved in that process that we could actually eliminate poverty for a much, much lower number than the amount that was spent, because of how much of that went as JobKeeper to profits and into dividends for people who are already wealthy. We could probably cut down to 1/3 of what the headline figure was to eliminate poverty consistently in Australia, and that would reduce most of the forms of vulnerability to climate change. Now, also, there's other forms of vulnerability. You might live in a community that is particularly vulnerable to drought. Your whole community might lose the industry that it depends on. So there's obviously a lot of other, things to consider in there. But if that's the link to income, that's the biggest link for me.
Good. I think one way of perhaps summing up the messages you're given is we sort of face a choice, whether we're in the union movement or whether we're in pensioner organisations or unemployed organisations or other, social welfare organisations. We face a choice, really, don't we? And that is that transition is going to be something that's done to us by those who own and control the situation and their government, or in some way or another, we're going to say, well, no, we're not going to have it done to us. We are going to take some degree of control over it through starting from within our own organisations. Now, in Australia, sorry, Luke, please go on. Yes.
I was just going to say, definitely, I agree with that. But also, I'd probably just say that it's already being done to us. It's not a thing that's going to be done to us. And also, it's not a thing that's necessarily going to be done to us by government and business. There is every possibility that we don't have a transition and that what happens to us is much worse than an unplanned transition.
Very well put. In Australia, Colin, you might like to comment on this. There have been, I think, especially since at various points during the 80s, attempts to assert some sort of workers' intervention into change in industry. So there's sort of experience that we can draw upon, for better and worse, out of that history. And there's a sense in which a just transition is a modern concept for an idea that we have tried to work with before. Would you like to make any observation about that?
Yeah, look, there's plenty of examples of unions and other organisations mobilising to talk about how transitions could take place in a much more effective and fair and progressive way over time. One of my favourites, which I think is now going to slip my mind, which is terrible. And the reason it's going to slip my mind, but others on the call, and Don, you may even remember, but in the UK,
Lucas Aerospace.
Lucas Aerospace, thanks so much. The Lucas Aerospace plan, which was it didn't really come to much, but it just showed you what workers were capable of coming up with. And for those who don't know, it really was about the workers, led by union delegates in particular, coming up with a plan for how Lucas Aerospace could be restructured and repurposed to produce socially useful things, including for things like electric vehicles and wind turbines, which is it's the 1970s. So incredibly prescient proposals, and really only the capitalists didn't want it to go ahead, so it didn't proceed. But it's a great model and a lot to be learnt from still today. We've also got a huge amount to learn, again, if we go back to the green bands and the BLS work, about the concept of socially useful labour. I think that concept is really important too. I think we've stopped talking about that to a considerable extent in the union movement, and we need to reclaim that idea of socially useful labour, but also unions' engagement in broader social movements. So social movement unionism, which really the BLF in the 70s under Mundy pioneered. So still, and Earthworker draws that I mentioned earlier, we draw a huge amount of inspiration from the BLF and the Green Band movement. So they're incredibly important, but there was lots of other really interesting plans drawn up, whether they were industry plans by the metalworkers, or the Communist Party, I remember, drew up an amazing urban plan for Melbourne. At that stage in Victoria, at least, the Communist Party, under the influence of Ruth and Murray Crowe, were very much interested in the broader spatial aspects of social justice and so on, and they had a tremendous plan for kind of a linear city going out of the southeastern suburbs with a railway line down the middle. It was really, so lots of those. There's lots of stuff we can learn from in the past, although there's lots of brand new interesting ideas. One maybe I won't raise it now, but I do think we have something that our movements, union and other movements, could really pin our hats on and really get mobilised behind. But I don't know if you want me to raise that now or wait till a bit later.
Perhaps we can come back to that, but and we'll look forward to that.
I'm interested.
Yeah, we're going to pick it up, but there's a question that arises also out of what you've both been saying. Luke, you may also wish to pick up on this deeper question of worker and community intervention and control instead of having it done to us, particularly with reference to COLI. But the associated question coming out of that is, if both of you could also have a go at this one. In just a couple of sentences, what do you think is the key message for workers in the fossil fuel industry? So, Luke, your
The
turn.
problem with this is that you've put a proviso of just a couple of sentences on a message that really requires more. In order to do justice to a message to fossil fuel workers in the situation that they're facing now in this country, where they're being set up as a sacrificial lamb at some point in time, where they're potentially just going to lose a whole lot of jobs without transitions, I don't think I can give you something in a couple of sentences. What I will say is that, fossil fuel workers are not the enemy. Fossil fuel workers are ordinary people who are working jobs to make their life, a worth living. And that what we need to do as movements who support climate justice and action on climate change is that make sure that those workers' concerns are listened to, and that the communities that those jobs support, that the communities that they support are given the support that those communities need to remain viable. And so, you mentioned COLI, and the reason that that's been mentioned, obviously, is because Climate Justice Union is playing a support role with the transition work in COLI here in Western Australia, which is the coal mining town that also contains the coal-fired power plants that have run most of Western Australia's electricity grid for the last 100 years. Those workers have, suffered through the impacts of working around coal throughout their lives, the health impacts. Sure, they've had relatively good paid jobs, but that community has been absolutely central to the success of Western Australia and the Southwest as a state. And so the work that we did to support the transition is supporting the unions that are already working down there.
Which ones are they, Luke?
So they're the Australian Metal Workers Union. So their members, and I'm going to try and say them in alphabetical order, but so that their workers essentially work in all of the repair and maintenance type works on both the mining and the coal-fired power plants equipment. Then there's the Australian Services Union, and here in WA, their people operate the coal-fired power plants that are owned by Synergy, the state government generator, who's also a retailer. And then there's the CFMU Mining and Energy Division. Essentially, most of their operators actually do, driving the trucks on the mine site. And then there's the Electrical Trades Union. And the COLI at the Crossroads report, which, sorry about getting up from my camera, but I've got a copy here, which was launched in 2019, was a collaboration with those unions, with Beyond Zero Emissions, with the local council, with local Aboriginal elders, with Climate Justice Union, with the WA Council of Social Services, and large groups of community involved in that process. And it is a plan for how you replace the 1,700 permanent jobs in COLI that are entirely focused around coal mining and the generation of power through coal, with between 1,750 and 2,500 similar jobs that would also be permanent positions that would make use of the types of skills that are in the community, that would make use of the electricity infrastructure and the ports nearby. And some of the proposals that have been put into this report were designed by the unions and their members, and a bunch of them have then since actually been given feasibility studies and funding. And one of the projects to have zero carbon cement created out of the fly ash from the coal plant has resulted in a product called COLI Creek, actually going to commercial demonstration trials already. So as far as having a transition goes, if you get involved, if you're a fossil fuel worker, if you get involved in planning the transition for your own community, you will be better off.
Are we still hearing me? Yeah, okay. There's a little bit of hitch at the technology on my screen. So there is a question that is coming up. I think what you were doing there, Luke, was getting into some real nitty gritty about the capacity. This is a point that Cole was making as well. The real capacity of working class communities, because of the knowledge they hold about their industries, to be able to create alternatives out of it. This is the story of Lucas Aerospace, and now here we are seeing that in that example you give of that wonderful report that comes out of the Collie experience. There is a question that I've enabled Janet Burstall to be able to speak. Janet, are you able to ask that question now?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks. And just before I do, Luke, I was wondering if you could hold that booklet up long enough, slow enough for us to actually focus on it. Collie at the Crossroads. Great. Thank you. I guess you've given an example of a possible answer to part of my question, which is about the problem of the biggest pockets of opposition to climate action amongst workers and their unions is in mining areas, in fact, and this is part of why workers in those areas vote even for One Nation, if not the Liberals, and one reason why Labor didn't win the last election with its promise to reduce emissions by 45% by 2030. And one of the problems is that for a just transition to rate, it really has to be believable that people are going to have alternative livelihoods. And the history of structural adjustment isn't a source of hope. The structural adjustment programs of the 80s and the 90s with car industries and so on, only a minority or many workers were left behind in those structural adjustment programs once they expired. And at the moment, workers in the fossil fuel industry are often on well above a minimum wage. So it's not like offering a minimum wage guarantee is going to be the thing that changes their minds. But it's also that the ability for their communities to continue. I think that they think, all right, maybe we could go and work somewhere else, but our families are here, our kids are here, our friends are here. What's going to keep this community together? And I'm wondering in that context, what measures we can advocate that could turn that around. How can we make it believable? I don't think that while they've got union leaders who are arguing against.
Can we just focus on the question, please,
sorry.
Janet, and we can then get Luke and Colin talking about them. Good.
Okay.
Good. Cole, do you want to have a go first, and then Luke?
Yeah, look, it's a really good and important question, and I'm just refreshing myself by having a look at Janet's question there as well, just to make sure I've got it all there, and which aspects of it it would be best to talk about. First, there is a real issue about the credibility of transition planning, and part of that is because our experience and many unions' experience of the renewable energy industry, for instance, is the jobs have not been necessarily that great. A lot of insecure employment and lower wages. So it's a bit hard to persuade workers who are in relatively unionised parts of at least energy generation, fossil fuel energy generation. Australia, which is pretty well unionised. A lot of the mining industry is not very well unionised, mind you. Coal mining's fairly well unionised, but part of the problem in Australia is, companies like Rio Tinto put a lot of work into deunionisation over a long period of time, and we actually have to reverse a great deal of that. But certainly, Janet is very right about the experience for workers and unions of industry restructuring in this country. It's not good. And this is partly why when in our plan, but also whenever I talk, I try to tell people that probably one of the most important aspects of a just transition planning and climate change planning in this country is industrial relations law. because the industrial relations system in Australia is one of the worst in the OECD in terms of repression of unions. We don't really have a very serious right to strike in this country. It's very difficult for unions to get into workplaces and organise workers. The rules around EBAs and collective bargaining are all stacked in the employer's favour. So that all makes it incredibly difficult for workers who are workers of all sorts to feel that their voice is going to be heard in a restructuring. Because the system is designed to make sure workers' voices are not heard in the day-to-day running of most companies, and certainly in restructuring, they're not given priority. And in some industries, of course, there are special bodies like the ABCC, which are designed to destroy the way unions can represent their members. So really, one of the first things we have to do is fundamentally change the industrial relations system in this country. But also to come to the latter part of Janet's question about what do we do about union leaders who defend fossil fuel industry on the basis that it is needed for jobs. I do think we have to, I completely agree with what Luke said earlier about recognising that fossil fuel sector workers are not the enemy. But we also have to be honest to fossil fuel sector workers, and that goes for union leaders as well. We can't keep pretending that there's not going to be change in their industries. And unless unions lead in working through change, then, and at the moment, a lot, we're not really leading, I think, in a lot of places, a lot of industries. And unless we do, then the decisions are going to be made by the bosses. And often the bosses are international corporations that actually don't really give a stuff about Australia in the slightest. And they will make the decisions about when power stations close, and they will make the decisions about when coal mines close. And you get to that final stage, and unions are always fighting that rearguard action, which just means trying to secure redundancies rather than planning for a real transition and planning from a long way out for years, and insisting not just on training packages, but insisting on alternative employment. And there are lots of good proposals and serious proposals for good development of the hydrogen industry, green steel industry, and some around Gladstone and the Hunter Valley and things like that, offshore wind off the coast of Gippsland. A lot of that stuff will provide decent jobs in those communities. We've just got to make sure it happens, these jobs, these industries, and the workers are given priority access to them, and potentially things like wage maintenance. For some workers who want to go off and retire, we might have to, we have to do a whole lot of stuff about making sure that, as Janet said, it's not just about making sure people get good retirement packages, but making sure that they have the facilities in their communities that they want to continue to live there. And it's also going to be about, in many mining communities, especially in places like central Queensland, we're going to need serious economic diversification strategies, because once mining's gone, they currently don't have much in the way of alternatives. We're going to have to build those alternatives. And we have to demand this, and it's not good enough to just let governments say, well, it's up to the market to decide what's going to happen. This has to be serious, large-scale public investment and planning in the transition. Luke,
would you like to pick that up? Please pick that up.
That's what we're getting in Collie, actually, to some extent. I want to be clear that it's not a perfect situation what's happening in Collie, but we're actually getting a government here in Western Australia that's committed to ensuring that community has economic diversification, has spent tens of millions of dollars, has put government contracts for diverse different types of industry down in Collie, So it is a good example, but I think we also just need to also recognise that there's been some real good examples of real bad examples of, you know, the transition is already happening without a plan and people just losing jobs. So here in Western Australia last year, we lost in the oil and gas sector over 2,500 jobs. A whole bunch of those were from Woodside, but a big percentage of them, 750, maybe 1,200, somewhere around there, jobs went from the Kwinana oil refinery from BP here. Full disclosure, my dad worked there for 20 years and he was the final supervisor on site on the close down day who sent everyone out the gate. You know, what we get 6 months after BP closed that facility and no longer have workers there is them proposing to put a hydrogen and ammonia production facility on that same site. That is the exact perfect example of what not to do when you want to transition a workforce. All of the apprentices who live in the local community in Kwinana, who a lot of them probably had family that were already, you know, part of that employment, you know, working at BP and that kind of thing, because a lot of people stay in the employment of the family in those kind of big mining and refining industries here in WA. It's a common thing, you know, and those people all lost their jobs. No doubt when BP goes to, you know, set up this industry, they're going to set it up with much lower wages and conditions than what they would have had if they were continuing on from contracts that have been negotiated and held by unions for the last 60 years, you know. So yeah, it's a really good example of where fossil fuel multinational corporations didn't care about the workers, shut the place down, is now going to go rebuild on the exact same site in a renewable energy industry and has, you know, been allowed to get away with not doing a transition at all, basically. In response to the question about, you know, you might say the largest pockets of resistance to change come from the mining, oil and gas sector. I'm not sure that that's actually true, actually. I think that they are perhaps the most focused on sections of society. I actually think that the largest opposition to change comes more from people's politics and identity, and potentially from people who are, you know, strongly hold one particular identity. Then, you know, 20 to 30% of people in society still don't view climate change as one of their top 10 issues, you know, around 20% of people. And the fossil fuel industry employs a total of like 1% or under 1% of people in Australia. So it's not that simple, that equation. But what to do about fossil fuel workers and the heads of unions and the heads of, you know, political parties who are continuing to sell fossil fuel workers down the stream by telling them that they will, you know, if you're building a facility now, it'll still be operating in 20, 30 years. It's just not a reality. So I think the thing to do with those workers is just to let them know of the examples of the places that are already shutting down and where they're not getting, you know, what they need for transitions from those big companies. I don't think that there is, you know, other than helping those workers to get involved with planning their own futures for their own communities, I don't think there's a lot that you can tell them from outside that's going to change the way that they operate. Communities like Collie and communities like, you know, someone mentioned the Hunter Jobs Alliance there. In my day job, I work at United Workers Union, and we're one of the groups that are involved in, one of the unions involved in the Hunter Jobs Alliance. The community in the Hunter is going to plan its own transition as well, you know. And when you're asking about the credibility of the transition, the problem has been that people talking about just transition out of the green space and in the environment movement, totally disconnected from the union movement, don't even really, no offense to a lot of them who are my friends, don't even necessarily employ their own workers in a way that is aligned with the kind of values that you need for a just transition, and weren't involving unions in that space. The type of just transition planning that will be credible to workers is the one that they're involved in.
Terrific. There's a terrific question from Paul Obohoff about the Hunter Jobs Alliance. And I guess your quick remarks about them, Luke, and referencing also what Colin was saying about the Gippsland area and Earthworker and so on. There seem to, how are your organisations going about developing cohesive relationships between the different initiatives that are beginning to emerge. We're getting into the last 10 minutes, so it'd be good for you to talk a little bit about alliance building and in regards to just transition, community and worker intervention. Keeping in mind that in Newcastle, I think it was in 1974, if I can be cheeky enough to go back that far, there was a national workers' control conference in which one of the major themes of discussion was the capacity of workers through their unions to initiate much greater control over investment decision making in their industries. So we're really interested in how the linkage building is going and how your own organisations are tackling that aspect of things. And then we can go to perhaps one or two final questions. Cole, would you like to
So you
please
mean
go
link,
first?
it sounded like you were about to, this 1974, that conference is sort of related to sort of an Australian version of the Meidner Plan or something like that out of Sweden, which I still think is very interesting. You mean
I wasn't going there, but anyway.
The linkages between ourselves and other organisations, you mean, or the?
Yeah, well, there's a number of organisations that you've been talking about that are trying to do just transition interventions, community and union worker organisations. So what is the current state of play about how much they know about each other and are building solidarity with each other to grow the momentum? And how does how are you tackling that in your organisations?
Oh, we spend a lot of time talking to climate and environment organisations and community organisations. I suppose there are a few ways, just give some really practical examples. So before this meeting, I was presenting at a Friends of the Earth forum. They've just launched a survey that they're conducting with 6 unions, I think, about climate impacts at work and all of those sorts of things. And we're happy to support Friends of the Earth in doing that work. We do a lot of work with Friends of the Earth. They're very good on just transition and unions. We support, I sit on the Energy Committee in the Latrobe Valley Authority down in the valley, which is a governmental authority, but it's I participate in a huge number of the events that they run with communities. And
this is the Latrobe Valley?
Latrobe Valley Authority, yep. And then there'd be somewhat more different sort of approaches of where unions have established. I think I mentioned before Cooperative Power, which is electricity retailer, which brings together not only unions, and quite a few unions now, but as I said, Friends of the Earth and some community renewable energy groups. And it's a really interesting way to bring people together to talk about the interest that all of our very diverse organisations share in trying to democratise ownership of energy, but also in taking some form of climate action. So there are a few of the things we're doing.
Thank you.
I spend a huge amount of time, I have to say. We like to do as many solidarity actions as we can, school strike and all those sort of things. We get an awful lot of requests, actually, which is good.
Yeah. And Luke, you're itching to tackle that question as well. We're reaching right towards the end. So over to you, Luke, and then one more question for a brief answer after that.
Yeah, so I think Colin and I see a bit of each other in some of those spaces where the union and the climate movement do a lot of collaboration. So where Victoria Trades Hall Council is one of the leaders in reaching out of the union movement to embrace relationships with the climate movement. Climate Justice Union is probably the lead organisation, I would say, in my perspective anyway, at reaching into the union movement from the climate space and bringing in all of those voices together and bringing the union movement into to the climate space as well. So Colin was involved in the process as well last year, and so was United Workers Union. But we got around to a point last year through some Climate Action Network of Australia brown bags that were happening, where we brought some unions in to talk about what a good job looks like in a renewable
What is
energy.
a brown bag?
So a brown bag is a lunchtime meeting that's held by the Climate Action Network of Australia via Zoom, that started up during the lockdown, that they were doing every day of the week for quite a while, and then less often, but they're still doing them now. And they're really useful ways to start conversations. So while organising one of them, we then established a bit of a longer ongoing process that resulted in the Australian Council of Trade Unions and the Climate Action Network of Australia now holding formal dialogues between the climate movement and the union movement 3 times a year at least, and that's essentially, Climate Action Network of Australia is not quite a peak body, they're a network, but essentially they're the 2 equivalent level organisations. Now there's national coordination at the top level of the climate movement with the union movement. That's one really good example. And I think so. The other piece was about where are unions unified on this piece, and I think the one area, and we haven't had a chance to talk about it a lot, but it's occupational health and safety. The only time that I've been in a union space where literally every single union on the call, including the Australia's Workers Union, AWU, Australian Workers Union, and the CFMU Mining and Energy Division, and United Workers Union, all the other unions on the call, and Michelle O'Neill herself made the statement saying every single job is impacted by climate change and extreme weather already. And that is the space in which we have the strongest right to cease work. We have, so it's the strongest organising opportunity essentially that we have in the climate space within our existing industrial relations framework. So while I totally agree with Colin that we need to upend the existing industrial relations framework and return a proper right to strike to workers, I think we also need to be smart about acknowledging the fact that workers are already being impacted by climate change, and that by making those employers acknowledge that the impacts of climate change in that workplace are something that they are legally responsible for, and that they need to spend money and resource to address, that's going to give them an incentive to encourage government to do the transition faster and to support government to provide supports for employers and other things for adaptation. And it's also going to make the employer aware that they are then legally responsible for not contributing to making the problem worse. So if you identify that you are required to mitigate a problem in a workplace, then the least that you can do is not make that problem worse. And that's also an argument for using occupational health and safety as a way to argue for changes to emissions targets and processes in the facilities that might reduce those.
Good, and there's a lot of nodding going on there from Colin. Just one more question as we reach towards the end, and I do need to make a couple of general remarks at the end about the next 2 or 3 weeks, 4 weeks. But the question for a quick answer is this. For the group of people who are listening or joining in, both on Facebook stream and who are participating through the Zoom registration themselves, what would be the most important thing that they could do to support your work in joining together the situation for low-income workers and the struggle to reverse climate change?
Well, just quickly, I think we join the various activities that Trades Hall does with its We Are Union groups, support any climate or industrial action we are engaged in, and get involved in the life of the hall. There's many ways to do it, and join your union's climate or environmental action group if they have one, and many of them are now starting to develop them. I think they're probably the best things for unions to get involved in right now.
Good, thank you very much.
Say,
and Luke, yeah.
Yeah, I would say very similar things. My first comment was going to be join your union if you're a worker. Join your union and get involved in organising the transition for your workplace. You don't have to be in a fossil fuel sector to have a transition. I was on an enterprise bargaining agreement negotiations today with a dairy manufacturer. Anywhere that might provide some heat or electricity is going to be using fossil fuels. Anywhere that has vehicles is going to be creating transport emissions. And if you don't get involved in making the transition happen in your work site, then it's going to happen without you. And then, from a Climate Justice Union perspective, we are a very small organisation. We have 217 members. We have not enough money to pay our staff next year at the moment. So come and join Climate Justice Union. You can join if you're from anywhere in Australia. You don't have to be in WA, and you'll be supporting what is probably one of the most effective ways that you can ensure that there is organising around climate justice in Western Australia. Head to climatejusticeunion.org and join.
And we will promote both of those, all of those ideas in the follow-up to this tutorial. Thank you very much to Luke and Colin, and this is where we should see applause emojis and all that sort of stuff, to both of our guest tutors who have made wonderful contributions. And I dare say are a little bit frustrated because in an hour and a quarter, we barely scratched the surface in some aspects of the topic. The Living Incomes for Everyone campaign will be following up this tutorial on November the 24th, same time, 7:30 p.m, when we expect to have a new team of tutors, including, if all goes well, guests from the action in Glasgow itself. And we will be sending out notices about all of that in the next couple of weeks. And we look forward to all of you and more joining in on November the 24th. I'd just like to, before we finish, show everyone just, if I can get my hands on it, the details of the, no, I'm not getting it, not yet. Just give me a moment, bear with me, I'm a learner. Sorry, I'm going to show you the Trade Unions for Energy Democracy program for the next few weeks, and we'll be posting this to the Living Incomes for Everyone campaign as well.
While you're finding that, Don, maybe
yes.
I'll just, the big thing that I said earlier, I would say later, the most important thing we could do, I think, is we should have a federally funded job guarantee for anyone who wants a job at least the minimum wage. So we have no unemployment, and we should fight for a 30-hour week with no loss of pay across the whole union movement. Those two things, I think. So both incomes, unemployment, and climate change.
And so they would all be critical elements in a, if you like, a list of demands or a program of demands that make up a democratic just transition. That's essentially what you're saying there.
Yes, that's right. Yep.
Yeah. Now, I think hopefully everyone is seeing on the screen the program for the Trade Unions for Energy Democracy. It kicks off very quickly Wednesday, October the 27th. Of course, at their time is about 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock tomorrow morning. Not a great time for us to be able to join in on that one. But there are other things happening as well that we've been able to get information about. I think one of the really exciting ones is 5:30 to 6 o'clock on Thursday, November the 4th at their time, which means that's it's in the morning, of course, in Australia. The movement assemblies, the workers and unions, and then the global day of action for the trade union and workers block on Saturday, November the 6th at 11:30, and that will coincide, of course, with Colin's one-day face-to-face union education exercise on climate change and workers and unions that's being held under his program at the Victorian Tradesville Council.
It will also coincide with, sorry to interrupt you, Don, but it'll also coincide with at least two actions that are happening here in Australia, organised by Workers for Climate Action and 350.org and a number of other organisations. There's one in Sydney and there's one in Melbourne, respectively, happening on that same day, Saturday, November the 6th. So if you look up Workers for Climate Action and Saturday, November 6th, I'm sure you'll find it.
So if, as all of us have, but if we've all worked out what a terrible situation the Morrison government is placing all of us in, then they are opportunities for us to take real action to begin building the movements necessary that puts a stop to it. So there's the program, and we will be sharing that at our Facebook page if it hasn't already been shared. And we look forward to perhaps seeing your faces at some of those events. Once again, we bring the evening to a close. Thank you very much to Colin and Luke again, and to all of you who are able to join in. And we look forward to seeing you again at the next Living Incomes for Everyone campaign tutorial on November the 24th, and watch out for other exciting news from us. All of the very best to everybody. Solidarity forever. Bye.
Bye.